Welcome to DNA Clarity and Support. I'm your host, Brianne. Listen as I chat with authors and leaders in the DNA world about the family and personal impacts of DNA testing. You'll hear news stories, unique perspectives, find out about books, websites, organizations, other podcasts for those involved in the world of DNA. Please be sensitive to younger listeners as the conversations can get intense at times. This is a production of Watershed DNA. Learn more at watersheddna.com. Gabrielle, I'm glad that you're joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Could you tell me a little bit about how your book came to be and how you came to be connected with David and his family? Tell us a little bit about the origin.
I was a newspaper reporter in Oregon in the early 2000s, and I had covered assisted reproductive technology, surrogacy, and through that also the growing popularity of open adoption in the Pacific Northwest. So I was treading a lot around the concept of different ways in which people can build their families. And because of that, I wound up hearing about the story of this guy, David Rosenberg, who was an adopted man, who was a prominent business person in Portland, but also a cantor at a large synagogue. He needed a kidney donation and he needed to get a kidney from a friend because he was adopted. And it was a very touching, moving story that these two men had ties. David's adoptive family had ties going back to his friend and donor's family. His name was Marshall Spector, going back to the old country in Romania. But when I met David for the first time to go write about this impending kidney donation, one of the first things he told me in the dialysis center where we met for the first time was that he hoped the story would go viral and that his birth mother would see it and recognize him as her son. He was suffering from a number of very serious illnesses. And as someone who had been born in 1961, adopted in New York State, actually he was not adopted until 1963, but adopted in a closed, secretive adoption, he had no access to anything about his origin story, his medical history, nothing. And he wanted more information about his genetic hand for his three kids, not only for himself, but for his three kids.
So at the point when you meet David for the first time, he had not yet connected or even identified his biological family. And
no,
we find out more later in the book about his biological mother and father and family.
Right. So 7 years later, so the story ran, and it was a pretty standard, sentimental, touching story about the life-saving kidney. But it didn't go viral in the way that David had hoped. His birth mother, who happened to be living in New Jersey at the time, did not see it. It went viral in a different way, and 7 other people decided to donate kidneys as a result. But it didn't have the effect of, somehow landing on his mother's screen, I guess it would have been at the time. And 7 years later, he took a DNA test. He was dying in 2014. Actually, he got the test for his birthday in 2013, but by early 2014, he had results. And at that point, I had left Oregon. I was living on the East Coast at the time, and he phoned me to tell me that he had big news. And he said, "Are you sitting down? It's David Rosenberg. Are you sitting down? I found my birth mother, and she lives 45 minutes from you."
Oh my God.
The biggest thing that he had to convey, however, was that he had always believed that he had been given up, not wanted, an inconvenience to his birth parents. And that story was completely reversed for him at the end of his life. And he did meet his birth mother. He learned the story of his conception, of her pregnancy. Both sides of his family, both his mother and father, had done everything they could to try to maintain custody of their tiny son. But as unmarried teenagers in New York City in 1961, they didn't stand a chance against religious institutions, against their parents who were horrified, against the law, against basically everything, this entire system that prevented two teenagers from keeping their own son. And he was shocked. He was also shocked to learn, and this was the most horrifying thing, that his birth mother, Margaret Earl Katz, had done everything she could over the decades to try to inform David of all twists and turns in his medical history. And the adoption agency that handled his adoption never, ever passed on those messages.
It's just heartbreaking, because then you wonder how much that information could have been valuable to him earlier on in his life. And at that point in time, New York State had not yet opened up access to original birth certificates to adoptees. Things have changed now. That's a recent development in the state of New York. But at the time that he was searching and needing that really critical information, he couldn't.
He was completely cut off from it. And even today, so the law changed. It was passed, allowing adoptee rights activists finally were successful after more than 40 years of trying to obtain open access to the documents that told them who they were. And ultimately, they were successful in 2019. The law was signed early 2020. And then due to the pandemic, still there are some big delays in people trying to get their documents. But New York became only the 9th state in the country to allow grown men and women who happen to be adopted access to their own vital statistical records. It's insane.
Yeah. It sounds ridiculous to us now that this would be information denied to people who had no say in choosing to be adopted and be cut off from that information. But at the time that David was born, this was like the status quo. That was the normal expectation. As you've been covering or talking to other people who are adopted and we're doing the background on your book, how many of the stories involved adoptees turning to DNA testing or DNA testing somehow being a part of their connecting with biological family?
That is such a great question. I would say overwhelmingly, I don't have the actual data to give you because I just haven't sifted through it enough. I would say the overwhelming majority of people who I have talked to for this book and who have contacted me since its publication in January have sought information about their birth families through DNA. Keep in mind, again, only now 10 states allow adoptees access to their original birth certificates. Connecticut became the 10th. And if you happen to be in another state, if you're in Texas, if you're in California, if you're in Florida, if you're in Idaho, it's the only route for you to be able to learn, to get any information.
Exactly.
And for all of the advances that it provides and all of the resources that it can give a person who's been adopted, I still don't think, yes, of course, it's a fabulous tool, but there are some people whose families might not want to submit their saliva to a big tech company. There are many, many people who are reluctant to turn over their personal information to strangers in California or Utah or wherever some of the bigger DNA companies are. And I understand and respect that as well. For some people,
it seems like there should be multiple paths to get information and reconnect adoptee with biological family without DNA having to necessarily be the way that they go. The records exist. They're just locked up in files. And in some states, adoptees can request to go in front of a judge and plead their case for why their records should be open. And then the judge can make a decision. But even that seems like unreasonable, like an unreasonable barrier for someone to have access to information that's about their birth.
To have access to the information about how they got into the world, about who their kin is. I have a friend, a New York-born adoptee, who now has his records, of course, because the laws opened. But there was a serious illness in his family. His son had a serious condition, and he went before a judge and pleaded his case. This guy is a psychology professor. He is a well-educated, well-spoken, almost frighteningly well-spoken man who went before a judge to argue for the right to obtain his original birth certificate so that he might be able to walk backwards through the name of his birth mother and find any information about this genetic condition. And the judge just said, no, I'm sorry, that's not a convincing enough argument. How are you going to find, well, let's say your mother's name is Jane Smith. How's that going to help you? This was in 2015 that he did this. And I think there is also some sort of bizarre power that people enjoy wielding in these cases, in these states. And it's also, for me, it seems to be the argument that is often given by lawmakers to no, we don't want to open up these records. It might be damaging for a birth mother who is still holding on to the secret that she's had for 40, 50, 60 years. To me, is just immersing ourselves in this culture of shame that existed in this period in the years after the war, in which it was an incredibly stigmatizing thing to have a child out of wedlock. And I just want to go back to a point about why there were closed birth records in the first place for adoptees. In 48 states, all states but Kansas and Alaska, a system in the years, it was probably in the 1920s, it started 1920s and 30s, a system evolved to a dual set of birth certificates. If a child was born out of wedlock and was ultimately adopted, his or her original birth certificate was sealed in order to protect that child from the shame, and I use air quotes for that, of his or her illegitimacy, in order to protect the birth mother from the shame of her wanton ways. But most especially as adoption became a popularized and lucrative industry, to reassure the adoptive parents that nobody was going to come and interfere with their newly created family. And ultimately, that system of the closed original birth certificate and then the amended birth certificate, which was issued after the adoption was finalized, listing the child's new name and the adoptive parents as the original mother and father, that was the official record of birth, even though the entire document was a fiction, except maybe for the time and place of birth. And that system persisted, and it still persists in the majority of states. We still have that antediluvian, anachronistic belief system that we are upholding.
What's good to see is so many people are beginning to advocate for changes to that system. The right to know movement and the people who are working on changing the laws state by state. I check in on the website Adoptee Rights Law to see updates and find out what states are in various stages of changing the laws around open access to adoption records and original birth certificates. So in the course of writing American Baby, you became connected with David's birth mother, Margaret. And I'm wondering if you could give us an update on whether you've stayed in touch with her and how things are changing in the world of open versus closed adoption. I guess those are two separate questions.
So to answer your first question, I worked very, very closely with Margaret, who, as we discussed earlier, does live 45 minutes from me with no traffic because I live in New Jersey now also. I became very, very close with her. I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours with her, and we maintained a very close relationship. We were in very frequent touch. I actually just had a long conversation with her on Saturday. And she went from being a woman who had given birth as a 17-year-old girl in New York City on a cold day in December 1961, keeping that huge transformation the biggest transformation the human body can go through, besides being born itself and dying, is to actually give birth to another human being. And she had to keep that a secret for 52 years to everyone but her husband, who was the father of her baby. And when David called her in 2014 to reveal or to approach her by saying, "I think you're my birth mother," after a series of, lucky occurrences by meeting a distant cousin on 23andMe, who actually was an incredibly gifted genealogical researcher and was able to link him to his birth mother within 3 weeks, she was able to let go of the weight of having to have kept another human being, a secret for 52 years.
So what has been Margaret's reaction to American Baby being published and all of the attention that rightly so is being paid to not only her story, but also the history of adoption practices, how they were in America?
Margaret went from having kept this gigantic secret to everyone around her, to her other 3 children, to her community, to her friends, to unmasking herself as this courageous woman who had these experiences in our own living memory. And she has become absolutely a huge advocate for records to be open in all states. She speaks with me. She has a Facebook presence. As a young woman, she was a civil rights activist and marched on the street with her second baby and third baby in strollers. And she feels as if this has galvanized her to once again use her voice to speak out. So she's really energized by it and is so delighted anytime there's any shift for the good. And she becomes really enraged, understandably, anytime there's a setback. For example, in Maryland, last spring, the Maryland Assembly shot down a bill that would have allowed Maryland adoptees access to their original birth certificates. And she just throws up her hands and says, how could this be? Why are people still arguing about this? It's 2021.
I could see that it still kind of gets you angry. And I remember reading an interview of yours where you explained how angry you were at times writing the book. And it was understandably so, the more that we are learning about the history of adoption practices in America. So how have your feelings changed since the time you were in the research and writing phase to now? Has the publication of your book, now that other people can hold it in their hands and read the story, how have your feelings changed?
You know, it's funny because when you're writing a book, you're in your own silo. And I would go back and forth on the New Jersey Turnpike from Margaret's house to my house. And sometimes I would get in the car, having listened to her. We would usually go out for lunch. I'd take my computer. We would sit and talk about what happened to her. Oftentimes, more than once, we would visit the spots, the actual venues of where some of these events took place. We went back to the maternity home. We went on a tour one time of the neighborhood where she had grown up. We went to her apartment building. We went to the apartment where she lived as a young bride. And she would remember more things during those visits, of course. And on the way home from them, I would just find myself sobbing at everything that she had kept inside, had internalized, didn't have a place to discuss as a respectable, again, in air quotes, wife and mother who had had this incredibly transforming, traumatic experience as a young woman whose baby got snatched from her. So that made me angry. Then in another phase of the research, when I was really investigating the adoption industry and how predatory it was, how coercive it was, how exploitative it was, and frankly, how sinister and cruel it was toward the infants themselves, not only the birth mothers, but the infants themselves who were a product This was an industry. The birth mothers were the means of production. The babies were the product. The adoptive parents were the consumers. And when I learned about some of the experimentation done in the name of science to provide adoptive parents with the best product, I was revolted.
Something about like shooting a rubber band at the heel of a newborn.
The adoption agency that handled David's adoption was one of the preeminent ones in the country at the time. It was called Louise Wise Services. And it was on its board were a variety of physicians who as part of their oath as doctors had promised to have child welfare be centered in their lives, in their professional lives. And these people were using these babies as guinea pigs. And one experiment I discovered was the brainchild of a pediatrician who believed that he had a harebrained theory that the babies who cried the most were the most intelligent. And therefore, you would be able to match these babies with doctors, lawyers, business people, right? Theoretically. How do you measure the loud cries of a baby? Well, you hurt them. And he came up with this really horrific looking rubber band gun that shot thick rubber bands, the kind you would have around a big pile of mail on vacation hold, at the foot of a 10-minute-old infant. And he recorded their cries, and the United States government paid for that quote unquote research. It was called the Induced Crying Studies for 15 years. And he had, positioned his studies as saying, oh yeah, these babies who cry the most, they're going to turn out to be the smartest ones. And he would follow them for 3 years, continuing to hurt them. And then by the time they were 3 years old, they did some sort of modest intelligence test. And he said, see, I'm right. And this went on for 15 years. Thousands of babies across the New York area were subject to this.
And it's important that we're talking about these stories now so that we can slow down and think, what are we doing today that we're saying is in the best interest of children or birth mothers or biological families, adoptive families? What do we need to change? Still.
Certainly, I know that in your work, with the whole Pandora's box of assisted reproductive technology is something that, are we looking at what the future effects of it will be? Are we looking at genetic selection in the ways with the wide eyes that we should be? What are we pursuing?
And there's a connection there between the community of donor-conceived people and adoptees because of the similarity in the belief that people are born blank slates and that genetics doesn't matter. And that if we can tell them genetics doesn't matter, that we can make them feel that way. But from speaking with adoptees, donor-conceived people who discover that they were raised by a parent that wasn't genetically related to them, but weren't told that information, it is important to know your origins. And when you are not surrounded by people where you can see your own reflection in their face, you notice that you're different. And that has an impact on someone's identity as they're growing up. We intuitively can know when something's just not right. And the secret keeping aspect around that is what can be damaging no matter the circumstances of someone's conception and birth. So as you were talking about your lunchtime meetings with Margaret, it made me think back to earlier on in the book. In the prologue, you were introducing us to David, and you mentioned that you meet him for the first time at the dialysis center, and that at that time you were viewing yourself as being there as a reporter, not necessarily a confidant. But over time, things changed, and it's a different relationship when someone brings you into the very core of their history and their being. So in talking with Margaret, his mother, and with David, where is that line for you as a reporter versus a confidant? Is there a line or is there a gray zone there?
Oh, I think there's definitely, well, let me just explain a little bit about what happened. So I wrote the story that appeared in the fall of 2007. But David Rosenberg was such a gregarious person, he did not know strangers. And once the piece had been published, I became his friend. I tried to keep some distance, I think, before then, but it was pretty much impossible. He was like, come for dinner. And my husband and I came for dinner, and I met his children, and they met our children. And we left Oregon for New Jersey in 2008, and we kept in touch by phone. I saw David a couple of times. I saw his wife, Kim, a couple of times when I would go back to visit my family. So in those interim years between 2007 and 2014, I was very aware. I didn't live close to him anymore, but I was very aware, and he always reminded me, I'm still looking for my birth mother. I'm hoping to find my birth mother. And it's important to note, I don't know if we've talked about it yet, but he was dying, and he knew that he was running out of time. And it was a very strange experience because I was here, I think the book Philomena, the book about the Irish woman who was forced to surrender her son, that came out, I don't remember when exactly, maybe 2010, 11, something, 2009, 10, 11. And I remember thinking about David's wish that his birth mother would see the story about his kidney donation published in the Oregonian, right? I mean, the chances of that are pretty unlikely. It was quite likely that she had remained in New York, his birthplace. He had gone to Oregon, but still he had this hope that she might see it. And whenever I would go into New York City, I would look around. I would look at women on buses. I'd look at women on the subway of a certain age. And I would think, I wonder if I wonder if this person is related to David Rosenberg. I guess maybe I thought I had some sort of eyes for him in New York. It wasn't like it was overarching thought or I thought it all the time, but occasionally I would wonder, could that be her? It would just flicker across my mind. Could that be her? And so the line between reporter and confidant, I guess I would say more than anything, I became his friend. And when he did locate Margaret, finally in 2014, 3 months before he died, I said, what do you want me to do with this information? And he said, you know what to do. Make sure it doesn't happen to anybody else. These records should not have been secret. I should not have been prevented from meeting my birth mother, my birth siblings. By that point, his birth father had died. I should not have been prevented from meeting them. How many other thousands of people millions of people are in this same boat? It's wrong. Change it.
You've done exactly what he asked. You've written his story, his mother's story, his father's story too.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so much in the book that I want listeners to get a copy themselves and just read the details themselves, because there's only so much we can talk about in a podcast interview. So where would you send readers who don't yet have a copy of American Baby?
I would send them to their local independent bookstore. They are such linchpins in our society and in our communities, and we need to cherish them for the treasures they are.
I agree. So brick and mortar bookstores in your local town ought to carry American Baby. And if they don't, you can request it be special ordered, maybe request a couple of copies so that it's on the shelf for other readers to pick up as well. So your book is coming out in paperback, and maybe for some listeners, by the time they hear this discussion, it will already be out in paperback. So we will send them to their local brick and mortar bookshop and get the whole story. Read it from start to finish. Awesome. In your own family, has there been any interest or involvement in DNA testing yourself or anyone close to you?
Yes, I took a test and my father took a test. Interestingly, my mom took a test. Interestingly, I got an email through 23andMe from a first cousin once removed several years ago. And she'd been adopted and was curious about her biological origins. And I wrote back immediately and I said, please don't be scared off. I happen to be writing a book about this, but here's who I am. Here's my brother. We welcome you. Please feel free to contact us and we'll share any information with you that would be helpful in your search. And my sister-in-law and I almost instantly determined how we were related to this person. And I was ready to, provide this cousin with any information that she needed, but I didn't hear back from her. And ultimately, maybe a year or so later, I sent another email and said, listen, I'm, just want to reiterate the offer to share with you any more information that you might need. And she had made contact with a half sister who was very rejecting, very ashamed, and really didn't want anything to do with her. And I think, that's an experience that I've heard repeated many, many times for every story of Margaret and David, who had a joyous reunion. There are many more people who are not welcomed. And I think that it was probably very, very painful for her to have received that treatment at the hands of the only biological relative she had ever communicated with in her life, or the closest biological relative she'd ever communicated with in her entire life. So she probably just didn't want to continue to torment herself with future interactions, even though I was very welcoming to her, but I can understand how painful that must have been.
Yeah, it's complex, the family situations. And it can be a different situation if the existence of the person out there is known versus it coming up as a complete surprise. And I've worked with some biological fathers that were discovered by DNA testing, and they discover that there was a child they had conceived that they weren't aware existed and weren't aware were placed for adoption. And adjusting to that shock and the shame that they also feel over not having known that they had a child out there and trying to figure out what is my role now and what's my responsibility and what do I do? It can be very overwhelming and there's not a lot of guidance. So I have a couple of guest blog posts on my website that have been written by men who find themselves in this position of discovering a child they didn't know existed and how they coped, how they reacted, and their advice for other men that find themselves in those shoes. So for listeners who are running into a challenge, either not really knowing how to react to someone reaching out to them, that's maybe a surprise new family member, or someone who's feeling rejection, I think talking about the different experiences and realizing the shock and trauma happens across the board, and sometimes passage of time or trying different means of communication can help. It's slowing down communication and writing letters instead of taking it to social media. I've seen that can be helpful. It's kind of a side topic, but it definitely is overwhelming to the point of not to the discovered biological family. They aren't always sure how quickly or how to react. Mm-hmm. So trying to have patience for all the parties involved. It's really hard. The waiting is the hardest part. It's what I've heard from people on both sides, just waiting for that next response to come. The waiting is the hardest part. So trying to lean on support systems, working with counselors and therapists can be really valuable. Just so complicated. But thank you for sharing your family story. I'm sure that even though she wasn't interested in continuing the conversation with you, having you reach out and be open and willing, I'm sure that meant something to her.
I hope so. I heard a story. This was a really arresting story last weekend. I was at a literary festival in my town talking with an adoptee about her book and my book. And a woman who was a friend of a friend came up to me afterwards. And I had known that she was adopted, and she had conveyed that she really wasn't that curious. She'd had a great adoptive family and didn't want to open that Pandora's box of maybe being rejected or finding something that was uncomfortable. But ultimately she did. Reading the book sort of piqued her curiosity. She was from a state that allowed her access to her original birth certificate. She found it, did not take a DNA test, but determined her birth mother's name, found the birth mother very swiftly through an obituary. She had died in 2019 and had two survivors. She had a half brother and a half sister. And she waited and waited and waited and waited and thought, I don't know. I don't want to impugn their mother's memory to them. What if they didn't know about me? Finally, last week on September 30th, she wrote to her brother and within 10 minutes received a response that said, "Dear Jane, we've been waiting for this email our entire lives. We know about you. We love you. Here is a photograph." It's going to make me cry. Here is a photograph of you as a 6-month infant that our mother took of you. It was the last memory she had before she was forced to sign termination papers. She displayed it alongside all of our family photographs. We all knew about you. She was buried with a copy of it. And I was born missing you.
Oh,
with love,
goosebumps.
With love, your brother. I know that's sort of a 1 in a million story. Oh, I'm really so moved by it.
I don't think it's a 1 in a million. I think this is happening for more and more families, that DNA testing has opened up a way for people searching who know that child is out there, that sibling, that niece or nephew, that grandchild. And it's another way to make it possible to reconnect.
You're absolutely right. It's not 1 in a million, but I think her experience of being welcomed, she was not expecting. And that for me was just such a beautiful story. And I'm so glad that can happen and that it does happen. Yeah. And that people like you are out there helping to facilitate those gigantic questions of identity and belonging. So important.
And I'll take just a minute to talk about the DNA Guide for Adoptees, which is the book that I wrote with my friend Shannon Combs Bennett. And it includes information on how to try to search adoption records, gain access to original birth certificates, and go the DNA route, depending on where someone lives and when they were born and adopted. Also, it has information on joining registries, which are online matching, where you list yourself and your information. And it's almost like a way to try to make matches between searching family and the people they're searching for. So there are different adoption registries that some are state specific, some are nationwide. So there's information on that in the book. And then how to actually use the DNA testing to search, and then how to make contact. There's a chapter on making that first contact and kind of what to do and how to do it. And then the entire last part of the book is on medical topics, which for people like David would be helpful. How do you seek out information if you don't have full family history? Is there a DNA test for medical purposes that might be helpful for you? So I think between your book and my book, there's a lot of ways to get in touch with family, biological family, and lots of reasons to take the step if you haven't yet.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I've really appreciated it. And it's been a pleasure to talk with you, Gabrielle.
Likewise, Brianne. I really appreciate your inviting me, and it's a really thoughtful podcast. I appreciate your questions.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of DNA Clarity and Support podcast. Head on over to watersheddDNA.com to learn more about the resources and support available for those involved in DNA discoveries.